Let me ask you one thing. I'd like to focus on the way the Bundesbank used to operate, in that it was completely separate and completely independent from the political process, from the government itself. But the ECB seems to have been drawn into the political process, and that's different than the way the Bundesbank was operated. Doesn't that ultimately mean that that's going to weaken the euro? Because now that it's under the political process, rather than making the tough decisions, like back in May 2010, they told the ECB to buy Greek government bonds rather than making the tough decision, don't buy Greek government bonds. Isn't that going to ultimately weaken the euro, and that in itself will cause problems for the eurozone?
Indeed, yes, but I want to take it from a different point. If somebody suffers from a heart attack, there are two chances. Either you give him a helping hand and dial 999, or you say to him, well, I know you smoked, somebody who suffered you smoked, you drank too much, and you did eat too much and too much fast food. I belong to the part who says, I'll give this person a helping hand. And we're having a heart attack of our financial system. The ECB is still standing for a relative stability approach, I would call it that way. We are sterilizing these interventions, but in a world that has changed so much and is facing the toughest crisis since 1929, 1932, you can't play to an orthodox central bank rule like the Bundesbank had implemented. The Bundesbank was never faced with problems we are currently envisaging in the global and the Western world in particular. And in that respect, I think it's reasonable what the ECB is doing. I'm a fan of stability policy. And compared to the Fed, to the BOJ or the UK, the ECB is still very much on the stability path.
Yeah, I agree with you completely in the sense that the Bundesbank has never faced quite the crisis that the ECB facing. But I mean, back in the 1970s, I remember very well what at that time was considered to be a major crisis as the Deutschmark was strengthening relative to the other currencies, what it was going to do to the German economy. But eventually, German economy, German producers, companies became more efficient and they dealt with that crisis. But I guess what I'm getting at is that, when the EU was put together, the ECB was put together, certain rules were laid out. And, you either follow the rules or you break the rules. And when you break the rules, consequences usually are bad. And, throughout the EU, you see countries breaking rules. They're breaking rules on the deficit spending as a percentage of GDP. You're seeing the ECB breaking rules in terms of buying government debt. Isn't that bad?
It is bad, full stop. No doubt about it.
The rules were there in the first place in order to prevent the currency from being debased, correct?
But the rules were set up back in 1992. And in 1992, as I said, communism failed in 1990. And from 1990 onwards, we had a shift. We had deregulation, where things were just getting out of hands. The perfect market requires a polypoly. And we've moved in financial industries towards an oligopoly. And if you look at special markets, we can even talk about a monopoly. So we've set up a financial architecture which is not comparable to the 1990-1992 window when these rules were set up. We've seen a globalization where everything is intertwined and interconnected, and we've seen a deregulation which has increased the power of single institutes to an extent. Well, we have to answer the question, if we play to the orthodox rules of the Bundesbank or of the Treaty of 1992, we will have a global depression straight away, a meltdown of the global financial system, and we will have as a consequence a global instability in politics. And that may be worse in 1929, 1932, because then economies were not that intertwined. And think about Germany in 1933, that was a result out of problems, and I simply say, I'd rather break a couple of rules instead of allowing a situation where where millions of people will die on the road. And I have one more argument for that approach. If you look at the global economy, we in the Western world tend to focus on the United States or on Europe, discussing the merits of certain measures. Fact is, in the world economy, we've got 51% of world GDP produced by emerging market countries meanwhile. And they don't have our problems in that sense. Look at China, they've got a debt GDP ratio of 15%. Look at their consumption loans, 0%. Savings rate, 40%. Now China is standing out, but basically emerging markets, 51% of the world economy does not have our problems. 20% of the world economy are strong economies like Australia, like Canada, the Northern European belt, producing capital investment goods with indebtednesses that are okay. They should be also should be lowered, but anyway, we have 71% of the world economy being intact. 7% are being reformed. We are talking about the Garlic zone of Euroland, plus Ireland and the UK. And these reforms in the Eurozone are the utmost stringent reforms in the history of industrialized nations. They will take effect. Then we talk about 78%, which, looking forward, will be okay. Remaining is Japan and the US. 5% of the world GDP, or 4%, is Japan. They are imploding. There is not much of a virus into the world economy because simply they are financed by themselves. But it's a big problem, and the rest of the problem is the United States, 17–18% of world GDP. And that is a problem because none of the structural problems has been addressed over the last decade. Instead, things have worsened over the time. And all the measures being taken are cosmetic. And every woman getting older knows cosmetic can play a very good role for a while, but eventually you will have to cut. And that is what America will have to, the path America will have to choose, otherwise America will lose more and more status within the world economy. But what I want to say is we have 70% of the world economy being basically intact, and I'm not willing to risk, just to have an orthodox policy, this 70%, then I play to different rules. But again, the ECB, in comparison, has got still a high degree of stability policy involved.
Just going back to the rules one more time, the rules that were established in 1992 were basically the rules that the Bundesbank in Germany followed from 1950 to 2000, and it enabled the Deutschmark, to be the best performing, world currency during that period of time. Are you saying those rules don't make sense anymore?
They make sense, but the question is, do we choose an evolutionary path or a revolutionary path? A revolutionary path would be the implementation of the Bundesbank policies, and we let it just simply fail. That has got its charm, but the consequences are dire. Once you choose this way, you won't get the consequences out of the way. So once you take this decision, the aftermath will just simply be a domino effect, as I said, throughout the world financial system, depression in the world economy, and political instability. And in that respect, I think the evolutionary path is much better. And again, I want to come back to the reform again of the Eurozone. Ireland is well on the way. Portugal. We've seen that also with Spain. They are performing, yes. And now we come to Italy. The fundamentals are still in line and are have got a lot of potential. Basically, no reason why to sell off Italy. And now they implement reforms and adding up to an amount of 100 billion euros. And yesterday they said, all right, we will be checked with the implementation of the reforms by the EU, by the IMF. We are changing Eurozone here. We are changing the whole business model of the weak countries currently. And we don't get any, let's say, positive discount for that. Instead, we get a negative one, and that is ridiculous.
I understand what you're saying, and I think you're making the case that most of the political leaders would be making, but will the people who vote ultimately see that?
Well, if German professors like Mr. Zinn or people like Mr. Henkel keep on with their propaganda against the Eurozone, for example in Germany, it's not likely to happen. But the fact is that the mood within the Eurozone is changing. That is my...
changing in what way?
In the way that they see that the Eurozone makes a lot of sense. And I want to give you an example. I mean, I'm very often on German TV. But recently, we are getting much more appearances where I talk about the progress, which is not being done by my colleagues. And I think my colleagues have performed unprofessionally and unacademically, because simply they just look at one side of the coin, and that is, in my eyes, unprofessional, yes. Mm-hmm.